Good evening, everyone. Hello, and welcome to this Arbor Culture Association Wednesday webinar. My name's John Parker, Chief Executive at the Association, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you all to the Arbor Culture Association headquarters here in sunny Stonehouse. It's very sunny. It's coming in through the window like this, so that's why half of my face is like this and the other half is like this, divided by this dainty little nose you'll have noticed. It's been a few weeks since we had a webinar, so we'll go through all the rules again. Please say hello in the chat. Let us know where you're watching from, but please select all panelists and attendees when you make your comments. Questions using the Q&A button, please. We'll get through as many as we can at the end. We tend to have lots of questions, so if I don't get through them all, then my apologies, but we'll make sure we send our speakers the full list of questions and the chat afterwards. I'm very, very excited this evening to be introducing two great presentations, one from my good friend Naomi Zürcher, a fellow European Forum on Urban Forestry stalwart, and someone who may be familiar to some of you as a very loyal supporter and commentator in the chat of these very webinars. And also from Len Gillman, who's in New Zealand. We're very grateful to Len for getting up at, it's 5 o'clock now, I think, Len, in the morning to be with us today. Len's working on a project which is really, really amazing. And I'm looking forward to hearing from him and, of course, from all of you about what you think. Next week is a big one for us. It's our 50th webinar. It seems like sort of only yesterday, really, that we were scrambling around trying to work out how to transfer everything online. And now here we are, half century of webinars later, with a whole global community and a wonderful network of friends and colleagues all over the place. Thank you all so much for your support. Thank you, as ever, to the whole team here at the association, who are all absolutely wonderful. Particular thanks to Sophie, as ever, for running these events. It's a great team. It's a huge privilege for me to be working with them. So thank you all. What do we have for you in our 50th webinar? It's going to be a good one. We're talking all about the Plant Healthy Certification Scheme. And we're going to be joined by some colleagues from Grown in Britain, Dougal Driver, Amanda Calvert and Rachel Lawrence, who'll be talking all things plant healthy and explaining why biosecurity is so important and what we can do to help. So you can register for that using the link that I can see flashing up on my screen that Sophie has already put in the chat. We're unusually well prepared for once. We've got lots of webinars already sorted for the next few weeks, all of which are leading up to the big event of the year, the Arbor Cultural Association Amenity Conference. Now, unfortunately, some of you may have seen, we had to take the difficult decision to move this event online. It wasn't easy. It wasn't what we wanted. However, due to the continuing uncertainty around COVID, the worries around travel into the UK, excuse me, for our international speakers, and let's call it the unpredictable approach of the UK government, we decided it was better to just make the call early and create an amazing online event instead. So the theme is still Trees and Society, great speakers. It's all going to be held on Zoom on September the 6th and 7th. Please go and buy a ticket right away. I know you have to pay for it. I know we normally like to give things away for free, but we do need an income to survive and do all the stuff we do. So please do buy a ticket and enjoy an amazing couple of days, as well as exclusive access to all of the presentations to enjoy afterwards at your leisure. Right, enough from me. Let's get on with the show. Soon we'll be hearing from Len Gillman. But first of all, I'm delighted to welcome the wonderful Naomi Zürcher, all the way from Switzerland. Naomi, over to you.
So first and foremost, thank you, Sophie and John, for making this possible. Greatly appreciated. And so in consideration of the tree, when we consider what makes a tree, we usually think of biology and anatomy. But is that knowledge enough to realize long-term tree growth in the context of the built environment? Today's presentation is based on a chapter I was invited to write for a cost book project currently in press. The book's theme, Ecological Design. The primary audience, planners, architects, and landscape architects, to whom I have offered my professional soup to nuts recipe for growing large canopy urban trees well into maturity. The sections of that recipe offered today concern how best to mitigate the two primary impediments to growing urban trees, soil volume and spatial development. The urban forest includes trees in a variety of landscapes, traditional forest, open landscape, and isolated plantings. The ability of a tree to grow, be it in the forest or the streets of a city is the interaction of its genetic capacity combined with the environmental conditions that enable those capacities. Almost all our urban tree species are forest trees, originating in a forest somewhere in the world. Given how our built environment has evolved, it is critical that our understanding of what makes a tree includes its origins, its forest persona, and the context in which it evolved. What exactly is a forest ecosystem? And how does that drive the genetics that these trees bring to an urban ecosystem? A forest is a complex adaptive ecosystem, a community of trees and all their associates, related flora, fauna, plus soil with its organic layer, supporting a mycorrhizal network and containing a functioning microbial and invertebrate community, which, in combination, provides the air, water, and nutrients all associates in the forest community depend on, either directly or indirectly. Forests are a process of evolution. Forests don't happen in a day, a week, or a year. They occur over millennia, beginning with the specific soils they populate. Forests evolve in direct relationship to their environment, temperature, the soil's pH, and the availability of light and water will help determine what species are growing and where. Although a forest may consist of different tree species, space above ground is shared in competition, while space below ground is shared in community. Trees are social. They are collaborators depending on a communal rooting landscape, providing interspecies communication while enhancing self-management mechanisms, such as sharing of nutrients and early warning for defense purposes. Photosynthesis delivers the energy that propels the entire system's processes. While photosynthesis is primarily a function of leaves, trees also photosynthesize through their bark, woody tissue photosynthesis. The active chloroplast population is located in the cortex just under the bark, as well as in ray cells and even in pith, supporting bud development, root growth, carbohydrate allocation, and the refixing of internal concentrations of respired CO2. Tree architecture is reiterative, based on species-specific arrangement of fundamental parts such as branches. Individual forest trees will adapt their dynamic architecture to interspatial relationships that affect access to light, crown space, or gravitational demands on structure. As forest trees increase in height and crown space intensifies, their lowest branches may receive less and less light, reducing the ability of these branches to maintain their own needs and contribute to the tree's overall upkeep. The tree may then initiate branch shedding by forming a basal protection zone, divorcing the branch from resources supplied by the tree, ensuring branch death. Before the dying branch is shed, all usable resources that have been stored in the branch will be reclaimed by the tree. Trees grow with their root crown above the soil line, as do all parts of the tree that are covered with bark, which requires light and air to function. A tree's root system begins at the trunk-root transition zone, with the development of at least one first-order root in each of the 4 cardinal directions. The extension of these first-order roots forms the perennial framework responsible for structural support, transport, and storage. Roots branch out horizontally, decreasing their diameter, the zone of rapid taper, as they grow into fine non-woody roots, which, along with their mycorrhizal fungi, are responsible for the uptake of water and nutrients. Growth is opportunistic. Root exploration of the underground landscape depends on the presence of oxygen, water, and nutrient availability. Almost all of this extension activity occurs within the top meter of soil, with fibrous roots in the uppermost portion and even into the decomposing forest floor litter, extending approximately 2.5 to 3 times the width of the crown, depending species and environment. Forest soil is always covered by related flora, leaf litter, or other organic forest detritus, a constant recycling and renewing of organic resources. We now have the forest context for our urban tree palettes evolution. Genetically, our urban trees remain forest trees with the capacity to manage themselves. To enable that forest tree's capacities and provide a tree-friendly environment in the urban spaces and places we are asking the forest tree to exist, we need to use all those self-management strategies as the basis for our planning, designing, and management. The understanding that you can take the tree out of the forest, but you can never take the forest out of the tree, must inform how we address those two primary factors: an adequate accessible volume of open living soil and a building with trees ecological approach to planning, designing, as well as protecting and retaining during the spatial development process. The art and science needed includes the ability to be an observer of everything within the work footprint, not just trees, soil, and their environment, but how construction-related disciplines and project sites function. So let's look at spatial development elements that minimize environmentally destructive practices, urban forester-driven details which, if incorporated, implemented, and enforced, can result in an ecological design accommodating trees that can grow into maturity and a healthier urban ecosystem for all its occupants. Planning and design, where an urban tree will grow. Site evaluation and preparation, or the planting site, the where the tree will exist, is an essential element, in the art of growing an urban tree and must be evaluated for environmental conditions and adapted and prepared for long-term tree growth. While the site must support canopy, as most tree-delivered ecosystem services, or ES benefits, are provided by leaf surface, top-driven, you can't have the top without the bottom. It is therefore difficult to talk about where an urban tree will exist without discussing what that tree will exist in, bringing us to the critical discussion of that landscape underground, the soil substrate that's underneath all the impervious urban surfaces. Sometimes referred to as an urban soil, and all too often defying the definition of what a soil is supposed to be. An ecosystem comprised of the inorganic, the organic, and the biotic, the soil food web, providing roots with life's enabling essentials. The urban difficulty, the soil can only provide the tree's roots with life's essentials if the soil is a living organism. To put the soil structure into a relational context, we can summarize important substrate properties as follows. Total pore space, which determines airspace, macropores, and water holding capacity, micropores. Bulk density, the volume of soil particles combined with the volume of macro and micropores within the soil particles, and particle size distribution, the soil aggregates. Without these physical properties, plus the organic layer and the living community that all of this supports, soils will become biologically inactive. From an ES benefits perspective, not only is an unsealed living soil essential to tree health, it is also the foremost terrestrial carbon sink, and in conjunction with trees' roots, an essential part of urban water management, increasing water filtration and infiltration rates, improving the recharging of groundwater, as well as runoff interception and storage. This graphic offers a direct comparison between different accessible soil volumes and the tree size each volume can support. Unfortunately, the present approach to streetscape rarely considers the requirements of a tree. Rather, planners and designers usually focus on pedestrians. But if a design is to be successful from an ecological perspective, the design must consider both. An adequate accessible volume of unsealed living soil is exemplified by cluster planting, affording trees' roots a communal environment, sharing a larger unsealed volume of living soil, while requiring less total space in the landscape than linear curbside plantings. The result is a planting that, as trees mature, requires less maintenance to maintain tree health and can deliver an enhanced range of ES benefits to the residential community. Where space does not permit such a configuration, there are well-documented alternative strategies that provide for pedestrians while offering shared rooting space and a larger area of unsealed soil. This visual offers examples of such concepts using extended curbside beds. Although separated for pedestrian access, that limitation can be addressed through the use of various substrate techniques such as root paths, which allow for continuous rooting. The path should extend at least 30 centimeters into the open tree area, placing the root path opening in immediate proximity to the root ball. The walls of the resulting path should be compacted and lined with strips of drainage board and then filled with uncompacted soil, having the same pH and soil texture classification as the soil within the planting bed. When paving is installed, compaction of the substrate is required, instigating the problems. First, a sealed compacted substrate encourages root growth exactly where it will have conflicts with surrounding infrastructure, just under the surface of the paving, where condensation accumulates and pockets of air exist. Roots will explore and expand in these spaces, generating enough mechanical force to accentuate any structural or material faults present. Tree roots do not damage infrastructure. Rather, they take advantage of flaws in that infrastructure. In addition, essential tree root needs are normally accessed within the soil, but when soil is compacted, fundamental structural properties are eliminated. The soil can no longer function, not as a living organism, a carbon sink, an essential associate of trees' roots, or anything else environmentally beneficial. There are a number of alternative paving options, but the extent of substrate compaction will greatly affect soil attributes. What needs to inform our paving choice should be human usage combined with the greatest possibility for unimpeded tree root growth. The alternative surfaces in production today, along with their tree and soil advantages and disadvantages, are as follows. Dry laid pavers, the best for tree and soil, are set on a bed of tamped down sand with mason sand between the joints, requiring minimal substrate compaction. The sand acts as a cushion, which accommodates substrate irregularities and affords the uncompacted soil beneath the sand access to gas exchange and water infiltration. While the application of paving always reduces the organic layer, the fact that there is gas exchange and water infiltration can support a viable root system, which will, through life cycle processes, contribute fine root exudation of carbon compounds and senesced and decomposing root tissue to the soil. The dry laid technique also allows for easy adjustment to manage disturbance. The 3 Ps, porous, pervious, and permeable pavers that facilitate water resource management. Porous above and pervious below allow water filtration through the paver, while permeable pavers direct the water into joints that surround each otherwise impermeable paver, delivering a lesser amount of water infiltration than the other 2 options. Porous pavers are made of concrete with an open grid where the holes can be filled with vegetation or stones. Pervious pavers, traditionally made of concrete, contain voids which allow water infiltration across the entire surface of the paver. Continuous research has seen an evolution in materials, and a Japanese company has developed a permeable pervious paver made of recycled ceramic materials. All of these pavers are installed over a gravel subbase, which acts as the interim reservoir for removed surface water. Proper maintenance is essential for retaining infiltration capacity, and each product comes with its own maintenance protocols. Since all hardscape installations require maintenance to extend their functionality and their useful lifetime, the product requirements and cost should not be an impediment to use, as one must also consider avoided costs. Where these paving solutions falter is, as always, the need to compact the substrate. To mitigate this drawback, these pavers can be combined with opening covered soil designs, root paths, plus root-friendly material such as structural soil. Structural soils are based on a stone matrix, which will, when compacted to the load-bearing protocol, form a matrix which has enough soil and voids as to accommodate gas exchange and moisture retention within the mixture, supporting tree root growth and communal root exploration. When combined with the 3 Ps, structural soil provides the subbase material as well as the substrate, positively addressing the paver's limitations. While CU soil is the US offering, one can find proprietary structural soil blends in Amsterdam, as well as Sweden, Switzerland, and beyond. Structural soil can also be used as a retrofit strategy when paving is being replaced. Careful removal and thoughtful planning consisting of pneumatic excavation combined with CU soil and a dry-laid paving installation delivered a successful repaving of the area around this mature Cercidophyllum japonicum. It is important to note that structural soils, regardless of their producer or proprietary formula, were designed as substrate under paving materials. They were never designed to be used as a planting medium. Trees should only be planted into a soil that is compatible with the soil in which they were grown. All such initiatives come with a higher price tag than a standard concrete repaving, but the resulting cost to benefit is of no comparison when one considers the enhanced ES benefits combined with avoided costs, reduced infrastructure damage caused by tree root growth, and reduced tree maintenance costs as a result of infrastructure-related damage to the tree. What's most important is that the tree's life is extended with the probability of greatly enhanced root growth accommodation. Careful consideration has to be given to location, use, and expected pollutants in order to determine the most appropriate paving solution. Planning and design, how we construct our built environment. While planners, designers, and urban foresters do not directly construct, we do so indirectly with the design and build specifications we craft. In spatial development, the building process is given a great deal of consideration. As a result, building practices have evolved, but landscape impacting construction practices have not kept pace. Although there are numerous strategies for eliminating or limiting damage to important hardscape features, these practices have rarely been applied to trees or the landscapes which will be impacted by the project. We should not expect the design team or construction contractors to understand the workings of trees and soil. Urban foresters must be the initiators and the actualizers of any and all practices which reduce or eliminate impact or destruction of environmental resources. Specifications and the oversight they require are the tools that can effectively realize ecological design in all areas where trees are sharing space with spatial development. Such detailed specification must include the following strategies within the varied phases of build and design. The planning phase. Although planning is part of construction's design phase, for our purposes, I have separated them as what we do in planning lays the groundwork for what will happen throughout the design phase. A complete ground-based inventory to be conducted by an urban forester or an arborist of all trees within the project footprint, as well as those trees within close enough proximity as to have their critical structural roots within the project area. This inventory should not only include species, GPS-based location, structural metrics and condition, but also a soil assessment to determine existing compaction and an iTree eco assessment to determine ES benefits and their value. Assess trees' condition and structural stability are important determinants for retention. Our expert evaluation of collected data combined with the total value per tree will help determine protection and retention strategies, and thus inform where and how built installations will be constructed. The design phase determines how the project can be built in conjunction with tree and landscape protection needs. Construction equipment, drainage and grading, utility installations, storing of excavated soil, staging requirements, control of construction debris, spillage, washout, and sediment, as well as parking of project-related vehicles. A thorough understanding of all of this can contribute to discussions that will determine construction strategies that support protection. To install pipes, conduits, cables, and the like, tree and landscape-friendly design must consider the use of trenchless technology, normally only used to preserve hardscape features, to tunnel under roots, These strategies include microtunneling or jacking with send-receive pits, which must be well-sited and capable of receiving and sending so as to reduce impacts. The dimensions of the excavation will determine the need to sheet and shore to increase structural integrity. Horizontal drilling or auger boring, another form of trenchless technology, uses a surface-to-surface approach rather than a send-receive pit. As with all such processes, adequate space for equipment operation must be predetermined and defined, requiring a familiarity with the equipment and its operating criteria. Each technology has its pros and cons, and the selection of a project-appropriate strategy, including the avoidance of soil heaving, will require knowledgeable and experienced partners. Pre-construction phase. Once the project design has been completed, with the work footprint set and tree and landscape protection designated, the following actions must be required and included in project specifications. For trees within the project work footprint, any and all excavation must exclude each tree's protected ecological root footprint according to Dr. Kim Coder's research parameters. For trees landscapes, all at the defined perimeter of the project's work footprint, as well as for any areas that have been determined as requiring protection, a tree and landscape protection zone, or TLPZ, must be established and a significant protection fence installed prior to the commencement of any and all work, with the additional requirement that the fence can only be removed and the protected area accessed with prior written approval and in the presence of the project consulting arborist. The TLPZ footprint, as well as the fence, must be noted on detailed plan drawings. The structural roots of all protected trees that extend into the work footprint should be accessed using pneumatic excavation, such as an air spade, along with an air vac to collect the removed soil. Enabling accurate and root pruning perpendicular to the root's growth at the point of the cut of one root zone quadrant, the wrapping of exposed roots using moist burlap, and the replacement of removed soil immediately following pruning. The entire impacted area must then be mulched and well irrigated. This enables work to proceed unimpeded and without concern for protected trees having roots within the work footprint. The completion of the design phase will also determine the equipment to be used as well as its operating radius. Such equipment may warrant the need for clearance pruning, especially along the TLPZ fence line. The specification must define the professional expertise required to perform all such tree and landscape-related tasks, a certified arborist or equivalent. In addition, the specification must require oversight from the project consulting arborist during any and all such operations to ensure the use of best management practices and the upholding of all tree and landscape protection criteria. A thorough irrigation of any and all protected trees and the landscapes they populate 2 to 3 days preceding clearance pruning and the commencement of construction activities will improve the ability of protected trees to withstand the stress and trauma of construction. The construction phase. The need to access a TLPZ or traverse any tree-populated landscape requires the oversight of the project consulting arborist, along with additional access-specific tree and landscape protection. The TLPZ immediately around each tree should receive an installation of composted wood chip mulch 7.5 to 10 centimeters in depth, with a setback of 15 to 30 centimeters from the base of the trunk, to be determined by the extent of the exposed buttress area. If the TLPZ requires construction equipment access, additional protection measures must be introduced in the form of ramped interlocking ground protection mats installed over geotextile fabric, plus wood chips 30 centimeters deep, the combination of which greatly reduces the probability of soil compaction. It is highly recommended that utility service lines be placed in a conduit either in the roadway or located outside the existing as well as anticipated structural root zone of retained trees. Post-construction. Following completion of construction, the project consulting arborist must conduct an inspection based on the initial inventory to determine the extent of any impacts such as soil compaction within the TLPZ. Soil compaction is best, soil decompaction is best accomplished by specifying radial trenching with the use of pneumatic excavation, PE, such as an air spade. The procedure uses PE to excavate radial aligned trenches around the tree with a setback equal to 3.5 times the radius of the tree's diameter. The soil from the trenches is retained with the use of an attached air vac and, with organic compost added, returned to the radial trenches. This should be followed by a compost tea soil drench, composted wood chip mulch as previously detailed, and then thoroughly watered in. Consideration conclusions. The considerations offered are intended as a provocative sampling of possibilities. In exploring them, my thoughts often turned to Ian McHogg and the concepts he illustrated in his seminal work, Design with Nature. That all design must be informed by an ecological perspective, that design and its outcomes had to support all aspects of life, not just human, but the entirety, not just in a mindful way, but synergistically, symbiotically, providing a catalyst for the concepts offered. While specifications usually fall to planners, architects, and landscape architects, and we as urban foresters do not wish to take over their professional roles, it is essential that in developing an ecological approach to designing and building the tree-built environment, our expertise must be required. Excuses such as the project budget cannot afford to do it that way, or we've never done it this way before, are not acceptable. There is too much wrong with the corners that business as usual cuts, and too much at stake. The sustained health and well-being of all organic components of the urban ecosystem require an interdisciplinary incorporation of art, science, theory, and practice into every aspect of spatial development. Planning and design must focus on implementing ecologically creative solutions so that the end result is a sustainable, environmentally compatible built environment which can accommodate the needs of our urban trees, the landscapes they populate, and citizen well-being. What is needed is consideration of the tree. We have the knowledge. We just need to enable it. Many thanks, for your very kind attention.
Thank you very much, Naomi. Brilliant.
Welcome, John.
Huh?
You are welcome, John.
It was marvelous. Thank you very much. Thoroughly enjoyed that. Yes, Claire has just said great handshaking picture. I like that picture at the end there. Good work. Okay, if you've got any questions for Naomi, please put them into the Q&A panel. I'm doing that because it's over there for me. It might not be over there for you. If it's not, then ignore me. You put it in wherever it is. Brilliant. Thank you, Naomi. Thank you, everybody. Lots of you commenting in the chat. Remember, all panelists and attendees when you make your comments. So, great stuff. Let's move on without further ado to our second speaker, for whom it must now be approaching, what is it, 5:45, is it, Len?
There we go. Yes, 5:45. Still asleep.
That's commitment, that is, Len. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much for joining us. And now over to you, Len, for your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you also to Sophie for setting this up, and a special thank you to Naomi, who has been a champion for the ideas that I'm going to present and made this webinar possible. So I'll just see if I can manage to share my screen. So I'm a professor in biogeography, and I'm at Auckland University of Technology in Auckland, New Zealand. And the concept that I am proposing is restoring Indigenous names within the existing Linnaean system that we have for naming plants and animals. So a rosa by any other name. This comes out of a publication that I've had with a colleague and friend, Shane Wright. And whoops, we're going a bit too far here. This was published in Communications Biology late last year. So I'm going to give a little bit of a background to this idea and then give some details of the proposal and then talk about issues that have come up since that publication. So way back in the late 16th century, Shakespeare pointed out that names were not important when he said a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. But I contend that actually names are important. They embody history, they embody a sense of place and a sense of belonging. And I think they're particularly important to Indigenous peoples. So when colonists, over the last several hundred years spread across the earth from Europe, they tended to assert ownership over places and people, in fact, and they renamed just about everything from mountains, rivers, any important settlement. But more recently, some of this naming has been reversed, and so particularly in New Zealand, and I'm not sure about other parts of the world so much, but names like Mount Egmont in New Zealand has been returned to the Indigenous name of Taranaki. And of course, when that was first proposed, there was a lot of objection to it, and people bemoaning the loss of the name Mount Egmont. But over time, people have got used to the new name, and actually the younger generation now in New Zealand, where if you talk about Mount Egmont, they say, what? They don't even know what that means, because Taranaki has become the name that everyone has become familiar with. And I draw a parallel between that process of renaming places and landscapes to the process that has occurred under science. So the scientists have also renamed all the plants and animals with our beloved Linnaean system. But given that place names are being replaced or restored with the original Indigenous names in many places, I believe that we can also do the same thing with plant and animal names. They should also be restored. And to some degree, there are a few plants and animals that already have Indigenous names incorporated into them. So, for example, in New Zealand, we have a canopy tree species, Belschmedia tawa, and tawa is the Indigenous name. And so it's not unprecedented that we can use Indigenous names within our naming system. So the proposal is that we develop a process whereby Indigenous names can replace currently accepted names, but to do that within the Linnaean hierarchy that we have. So, for example, in New Zealand, one of our most iconic tree species is Aegis australis, with the Indigenous name kauri. And so the proposal would be that this species might become known as Aegis kauri. Another example, Metrosideros excelsus might become Metrosideros pahutakawa, to use the Indigenous pahutakawa in the species epithet. Exerba brixoides might become Exerba taraweri. And because this is actually an endemic genus in Aotearoa, New Zealand, it could actually be the Indigenous name could actually be incorporated into the name at the level of the genus. So it could be Taweri brixoides. Among animals, we have an Indigenous reptile, Sphenodon punctatus, and this is known in New Zealand as Tuatara. And because this is an Indigenous genus, it could become Tuatara punctatus. Or indeed, because the entire order is endemic to New Zealand, that name Tuatara could be incorporated throughout the whole naming structure. And of course, with animals, unlike plants, you can have a genus and species name that is exactly the same. So the process that I'm suggesting is that we amend the codes of nomenclature, such as the ICN and the ICZN, and they are amended so that it enables Indigenous peoples to submit replacement Indigenous names. And so this would be done through a process of publication in a journal such as Taxon. So the fundamental criteria that we're suggesting would be needed is that any publication would need to include some kind of evidence of a consensus for the name among Indigenous peoples across the historical distribution of the species, so that there is clarity about the application of that name within that area. And there would need to be some evidence that the name existed before the first published scientific name. And so that evidence might not just be restricted to written evidence, but also to oral history. This would then need to go through this a normal peer review process through the journal, but it would require specialist editors and reviewers in the social sciences rather, and people with expertise on geography and social science. So what are the issues that have been raised? So the first one is that the Linnaean system is, quote, unlike the Linnaean system, Indigenous names do not convey information about evolutionary relationships. However, we're not actually suggesting that we replace the Linnaean system, as some people have assumed. The beauty of the Linnaean system is that any name within the hierarchy can be substituted with an Indigenous name without disrupting the system in any way. So I'm not sure if you can see those there, but this species here, Piper excelsum, for example, the entire Linnaean system can stay in place with just replacing the species epithet with the Indigenous name kawakawa. So it doesn't disrupt the Linnaean system. It doesn't take away any information about evolutionary relationships by just substituting an Indigenous name anywhere within that whole hierarchy. The other objection, the second objection that's been raised, is that many species have a multitude or a multiple number of different Indigenous names. So this one here, for example, Wimania racemosa, has at least 4 Indigenous names in New Zealand. And so in many parts of the world, this will be an issue where the species has a whole lot of different Indigenous names depending on those people that do occupy or have occupied the area. However, under the proposal that we've put forward, if this is the case, if there is no single consensus on a name, then there would be no change. So it simply wouldn't apply in these circumstances. Third issue that's been raised is that many Indigenous names apply to different species. So you can have several species all with the same Indigenous name, such as this one here, Mingi Mingi, that applies to Leptocophila juniperina. It also applies to Leucopogon fasciculatus and to Coprosma propinqua. However, given that the species epithet could be substituted in with completely different genera, it wouldn't create any confusion, because we can have the binomial is different in each of these cases when you take into consideration that the genera are different. And of course, there is plenty of precedence for species epithets being the same across a multiple species. For example, this species here, Metrosideros collensi, climbing rata in New Zealand, it shares the species epithet with a large number of other plant species in New Zealand and elsewhere around the world. The other, number 4 in terms of objections that have been raised, is that the species and genus names are often descriptive. And for example, this species here, Fuchsia exotica, refers to the flaking bark on the species, and so a very useful descriptive component to the naming system. However, not all names are descriptive, as many of them are just recalling surnames from plant collectors in the past, and so it doesn't really create an objection that is consistent across our whole system. And the last objection that I'm going to consider, this is quite a brief talk, it's a simple idea, but the last objection is that if we Latinize an Indigenous name, we're actually creating further problems, because we're once again still changing the Indigenous name, and that's going to be problematic for a lot of Indigenous people. However, the rules around Latinization don't necessarily need to stay the way they are. We can change these rules. They are simply rules that have hung over for a very long time, but there's no reason why we can't change them. And so for the case of restoring Indigenous names, we're suggesting that these rules around Latinization are dropped, so that essentially that the Indigenous names are just transferred into the naming system as they originally were. And of course, that also, there are rules in the code around diacritical marks, etc. Once again, there's no reason why those rules should be retained, and should be, in my opinion, be excluded when Indigenous names are considered, so that we can include things like macrons in the Indigenous name. So this idea is not going to solve all problems that Indigenous people have with the colonization process and the sense of theft from a lot of the things that they value. But it will be an important step, I believe, in affirming Indigenous people knowledge. It will also show a respect for Indigenous knowledge, respect for the chronological precedence of the Indigenous names, and it may, I hope, further engage Indigenous people in science and in conservation. So if we, as a scientific community, we make the step to include the Indigenous names and the history from Indigenous people, that's going to further engage those people in the whole process of science. And I think that's a valuable step to take. Ngā mihi nui. Thank you very much for listening to this idea, and I'm sure that there will be lots of vigorous debate about it and objections, but hopefully there'll be some understanding for this idea. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Len. That is really given some food for thought, I think, and there's lots of questions coming in again. I'm rearranging myself, do forgive me. Just talk amongst yourselves, people. Don't mind me as I'm trying to shut my blinds. I've moved office. I don't quite understand how it works yet. There we go. Oh, we've got two Naomis. Well, that is it's the stuff of nightmares, Naomi. We've got two. Brilliant. Thank you, Len. That was really great. We've got lots of questions coming in. Carry on submitting your questions through the Q&A, please. And I'm just moving my Q&A over here so I can see it properly. I was going to ask Naomi a question. Oh, she's back. She's back. Naomi, just in time. So we'll go to you, Naomi, first, and then we'll go to Len, and we'll kind of swap about a bit as we tend to do. Naomi, James was asking, you showed lots of images of trees in urban areas and tree roots. And James was asking if it's possible to control the size of the tree through the way in which it's planted. Have you got any thoughts on that?
People have tried this in many different ways, all to the detriment of the tree. So the idea really would be that the tree has to match the site. And ideally, we try to plant large canopy trees because the deliverable is so superior. If the site can't support that, then there has to be a reality in what you pick so that the tree can be the tree it was meant to be without topping it or this or that or the other thing. And you end up with a much healthier tree and lower maintenance costs. So the answer from my practice would be no. To James' question. Sorry.
Thank you, Naomi. Yeah, because we often hear about planting trees in pots or deliberate ways to restrict the roots, but it doesn't tend to work very well in the end, does it?
No, and neither do root barriers. They have not solved the problem at all, and it just adds more insult to injury, actually.
Yeah. Well, actually, do you know what? I was going to ask you a question myself, and I'm going to do it now anyway, because it kind of leads on from that. But we've had many interesting discussions over the years, Naomi, and you're one of the few people who, how do I almost put this? Almost puts the sort of rights or the welfare of the tree alongside the rights and the welfare of the people who benefit from it. And we spend a lot of time in Arbor Culture and urban forestry talking about how trees do stuff for us and how they're good because they deliver us all these benefits. And you're one of the sort of few voices, I think, who are actually saying, well, what about the tree?
Right.
And I don't want to put you on the spot, but have you got anything you want to sort of add on that? Because I think we've had some very interesting discussions over the years about this.
Well, you know, we all have our respective practices. And behind my practice is a life philosophy, and it is fairly existential. And for me, my reality is that a living thing has a right to exist, regardless of what it does for me or anyone else. And that belief and that philosophy has informed my practice. So I, as an affiliate member of the iTree team, I promote ecosystem services, but my difficulty with ecosystem services is that's a one-way street. It's all about, again, us and what that tree is doing for us. But this is a give and take situation. If you want something from that tree, then you have to give. And that's the part that's often forgotten about, not just by average Mr. and Mrs. citizen, but it's also forgotten about by professionals. And, you arrive at the way you practice your practice based on your life experiences. And that's why I called this chapter what I did, in consideration of the tree. And one should never forget that.
Brilliant. Thank you, Naomi. And I completely agree, by the way. And someone was saying, who was it? Claire was saying we should be more Lorax. We actually talked about the Lorax when we had a meeting a couple of weeks ago, didn't we? So that's good. Okay, right, Len, a question for you. This is a good question. I don't know the answer to this. A question from Mike. Who ultimately decides on a plant botanical name? When you're talking about these changes, who is the ultimate arbiter for that?
This is deep mystery. This is
No, it isn't.
Yes, I have trouble getting my head around it sometimes myself, because there is in the code there's a very clear process as to what is the accepted name, and there can be only one accepted name. However, it's all done through a process of publication, and so a lot of taxonomical changes are put forward through publication, and it's the murkiness then comes into play, where people might disagree with that publication and publish a counter publication, and so there is often lots of different names that are floating around, but ultimately things like the Kew Garden plant list will sort of put a stake in the ground. And so we have a situation in New Zealand where new genera have been proposed to replace Nothofagus, but that doesn't appear to be accepted elsewhere in the world. And so we now have dual systems that are in terms of the naming of Nothofagus. So it is a very murky process, but it is through publication, accepted publication. And for plants, that is through Taxon, the journal Taxon. And so that's why we've proposed that restoring Indigenous names should be through publication and Taxon.
Thanks, Len. Naomi, go for it.
Actually, this is the work that I do for iTree, is reviewing every single submitted species for their taxonomic accuracy. And so the big umbrella, there's a variety of institutions that contribute to this sitting and chewing on all of this. But the main entity is ITIS, the International Taxonomic Institute, or whatever. But the INITs are ITIS, and they publish a yearly list with all the umpteen million accepted names plus all the synonyms of those names. So this is a giant process that is constantly in motion.
I've just Googled it, Naomi, and it's Integrated Taxonomic Information System.
Oh, thank you, John.
Other search engines are available, so there we go. Thank you very much, both. I'm looking all over the place here at questions. There's a question here I like, Naomi. Question from Marion. who's asking, do you have any specific comments on dealing with ancient and veteran trees and promoting the future generations of ancient and veteran trees in urban areas?
Okay, so first and foremost, they deserve an extraordinary amount of respect in the way in which their ecologically required footprint is managed. And that would exclude as much activity within that footprint as possible. And if one is really to support a veteran tree, so one of the things that I look at when I'm developing a planting list is I look at mycorrhizal species. I use that as part of my criteria of what I will put together so that I'm not mixing endo with ecto unless it is a tree that can do both, which there are some. So if it has an endo preference, and sure, there are gazillion subspecies within the umbrellas, you still want to be targeting the umbrella, the primary. And so what supports a veteran tree, if it is in an isolated situation, would be to incorporate within a larger footprint, not doing damage to its existing root structure, but supporting it with species that it can have a relationship with that would support it in its maturing years. And clearly, if it is producing seed and it is a valuable veteran and valued for whatever reason, what it's witnessed, who knows what anything and everything that people value a tree for, then why not propagate its offspring and be concerned with the where that you will put those offspring, because just wanting to perpetuate the veteran does not necessarily perpetuate it. One needs to be thoughtful about the where you plant.
Yeah, thanks. And I mean, I know that Neville Fay's watching. Hi, Nev. And we've talked before about propagating from ancient trees as well. So Neville may well say some words of wisdom in the chat at some point about that propagation of ancient and veteran trees. I'm going to sort of move slightly sideways because we talked about ancient trees there, but also something else interesting that we've talked about again, Naomi, but the sort of ancient veteran trees and the spiritual aspect of trees as well. And Len, I'm wondering, I know that in New Zealand, we often see stories about sort of sacred trees and trees that are important spiritually to Indigenous peoples being felled or whatever it may be. I was wondering if there was any input from that wider sort of cultural relationship with trees in New Zealand that's fed into this project that you're doing as well.
Not directly, but yes, it's all part of the same picture. Yes, the trees and animals are valued hugely by Indigenous people in New Zealand, and my partner publisher is an Indigenous person from New Zealand, so there's certainly that input from that aspect. And of course, in New Zealand, we have a treaty which guarantees the Indigenous people the right to all of their taonga or things of value. And I would say that the names that they have had for many, many centuries for these plants and animals are part of their taonga. And to, superimpose a new name, which is merely sort of honouring some collector or a even an employer or a funder from the colonial process is basically trampling on those and disrespecting those names and those taonga.
Yeah, I think there seems to be quite a strong sense of that in New Zealand. I know that one of our previous speakers, another friend of mine, Howell Davis in Auckland, has produced the tree strategy there. And when I read that, I was really impressed with how it brings in a wider sort of cultural, spiritual, and Indigenous perspective, as well as just being a tree management strategy. So it seems to be quite there seems to be awareness of this in New Zealand that perhaps doesn't exist in a lot of other countries.
It will eventually in other countries.
Yes.
Hopefully so. That's what we're doing right here. That's what we're doing right here, right now. So brilliant. Thank you, Len. Okay, as always, we jump all over the place here, but a question for Naomi from Catherine. What does Naomi think about urban agriculture in cities? It's a little bit left field, not necessarily what you deal with day to day, but urban agriculture.
I think it's a critical part of the umbrella that is urban forestry. So, you know, if I think of the urban forest, for me, the urban forest should begin at a person's door. So if you think of what's outside your door as your neighborhood, then green should be an essential element in your neighborhood. That trees and plants and the soil in which they grow, they're your neighbors. And so however you choose to green, and you know, I did this book on participatory urban forest management, and community gardens and urban agriculture are a critical part of engaging people in the entirety of what an urban forest is. So I think it's great and should be supported. For example, if there's a park in a city, why can't part of that park be given to a community to grow things in, whether it's through urban agriculture or as a community garden or whatever? It's such a bonding, this act of growing. If you think that all of us come from an agrarian background at some point in our history, it is a way of really coming back to the who that you are and really were in your roots. And it's also a way of bringing the disenfranchised into the larger society. That if you give communities space to have a community garden or do urban agriculture, and you require that there's a day open for the public, then you have a chance for people to discover that they have common ground. We all have this background, and isn't it fascinating to see how somebody else grows something? So this is an essential urban agriculture, community gardening, whatever you want to call urban greening, is all essential to the well-being of an urban ecosystem.
Yeah. And here in the UK, we have allotments, the allotment system, and gardening and urban, which I guess is a kind of urban agriculture. But yeah, community engagement, isn't it? It's all accessing their spaces. Brilliant. Okay. What was I going to... yes, right. We've got a question from Sophie for you, Len. You mentioned some of the different sources of resistance that there's been to the project you're working on. And Sophie's asked what you would say has been the biggest source of resistance to the idea. And just to expand it myself a bit, over here, I think, and around the world, there's... debates going on about statues, for example, and what people we want represented in our public places. And we've got people pulling down statues, and we've got people saying they should be kept up. And any attempt to, I suppose, reinterpret our history, there's this term of woke now, of, you're too woke, and it's the new political correctness. So I'm wondering, is that something that this project is being accused of at all? And if not, then what is the biggest resistance you're facing?
I haven't heard the term woke being applied to it, but there is resistance just because people resist change, and they're very much embedded in the system that has existed for so long. So there's always resistance to change. But I think it's the sort of thing that, the more people think about it, the more they actually engage with it. And it's something that may take time for people to sort of get used to. But at the end of the day, something that's called Agathis Kauri is not going to be, it's not going to hurt anybody. And on the other side of the ledger, it's going to mean an awful lot to the Indigenous people that have history of that particular species that go back many centuries. They've used that species for all sorts of things, for canoe building. So many of, I'm overwhelmed with the amount of knowledge that the Indigenous people have of the plants and animals. They have a very intimate knowledge of all sorts of aspects of those properties. And so it is a recognition of that knowledge and a recognition of their history. And really, do we have the right to do what we do in terms of, bulldozing over those histories and giving things new names without recognizing a lot of that past information? And of course, even the botanists that came along and gave scientific names to species, for example, in New Zealand, they relied on the Indigenous people to tell them about those species in the first place and tell them about the properties and what they were used for. So it is just a recognition, I think, a justified recognition of priority. We talk about priority in the scientific system, whereby priority is given to the first correct or correctly published name. But what about priority to a name that has existed for centuries and is built on huge amounts of knowledge about that ecosystem, about those species? So I think the biggest resistance is just resistance to change itself.
Absolutely. Naomi?
So, Len, one of the things that may be of some help in breaking down the barriers, of late, you see more and more articles suggesting and recommending that losing Indigenous knowledge is another form of the white European kicking themselves in the rump. That if we are going to change business as usual and start addressing how we manage the varied aspects of the natural world, we need to tap into that existing wisdom. And that recommendation or suggestion or thought process may help in changing ideas of this colonial naming practice.
Sure.
It's part of a much bigger issue, I guess, in many ways, isn't it? I'm thinking of Papua, and I know that again another friend of the association, Paul Mandabondabo, has been in contact, Len, because he's hopefully going to contribute to the project as well. But you've got parts of Papua where the colonizers came in, they named the trees, then they made the local people cut down those trees so they could take them and sell them, and then they planted other stuff, and it's just like offense and criminal action piled on one another, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
So the Arbor Culture Association is probably neutral in such matters. I apologise to anyone I'm offending other. Okay, there's loads. Oh goodness, Nick, that's a long question. I'll read that in just a minute. What was I going to ask? A question. James has asked, can we please have the presentations available after today? We'll the presentations will be available on our website, and I'm sure if somebody needs a copy of the PowerPoint or PDF or whatever, then email me, john@trees.org.uk, and I'll be able to talk to Naomi and Len about that. So if you want to watch it again, then please do let us know. And right, a question from Nick to Naomi. If the site becomes the determining factor for tree selection? Is there a risk that developers simply plant smaller trees and therefore we lose the large canopy that is being sought? How do we encourage developers to ensure that trees have the space they need?
So, first of all, the whole idea of what I was presenting is to make the participation of those of us that one considers tree experts to be directly involved with this entire process of how you plan and design a project. Now, everybody has different rules and regulations about private property. And the developer is usually a category that goes with private rather than public. But one of the mechanisms that has been used is a tax incentive to reduce the number of trees that are removed, to provide a tax incentive to the developer to hold trees and not just retain them, but with all the baggage that comes along with how these trees must be protected during the design and build process. So that's one mechanism. And another mechanism is to write ordinances, because as things go on, we see more and more that business as usual doesn't work. And if you think about European cities and the way they were built, look at small cities in Italy. You really can't have trees along the street. The green is in the private gardens. And so if you exclude this from the thought process of how you green a city or a village, then you've lost many possibilities. And so there needs to be more of an understanding of how much damage we do to ourselves by not supporting better greening protection and greening installations so that trees can actually grow. And I think with this sort of encouragement of this understanding of the cost to benefit, because trees are one of the cheapest things you can do to benefit society. But if you want the tree, then you have to enable those capacities and give them the space they need. In addition, if you grow large canopy trees and you actually grow the thing, you need less trees. Give the tree the space it needs, above ground and below ground.
Yeah, it's the below ground bit that's often forgotten about as well.
Can't have top without bottom.
Very true. Thank you, Naomi. I'm just going to pick out a question for Len from Neville in the chat, which I don't normally do, as we know, but I do tend to do for Neville because Neville forgets where the Q&A question button is. But I forgive you, Neville, because I love you. Neville's saying, should First Nation native plant knowledge people be recruited into the Linnaean Society? Is that another sort of angle of attack that we can make for this project, to get people?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yep.
But of course, a lot of this needs to be initiated by Indigenous people. They need to become part of the debate and get involved. But often there is there are all sorts of barriers to Indigenous people engaging. But we've also got a large number of Indigenous people now that are scientists, and there's no reason why they can't be engaged in this whole process.
Yeah. And I guess just sort of following on from that, and this is a question from me, sorry, but how how can people get involved? How can people support this project and put pressure on, you know, the Linnean Society, whoever it is, to actually make these changes? You know, we've had a couple of hundred people watching tonight. There'll be many more watching the recordings. The Arbor Association's got a social media reach of 50, 60,000 odd. How can people watching now who are thinking, this is a great idea, how can they actually do something, do you think, then?
That's a really good question, and I'm not sure what the answer is. Maybe Naomi has some ideas there.
Naomi's always got ideas, then.
So given my little job at iTree, so one of the things that I've done, I convinced the team that we should have an additional column in the iTree species database. And that column would be Indigenous names, so that you have the existing taxonomic accepted name, you have the common name that is normally used in English, and then you have the Indigenous name. Now, that's not solving the taxonomic authority thing, and I don't have that power personally. But what I can do is I can introduce people to Indigenous names from all over the world that may inspire them to sign on to this larger idea of changing how we name species. Because every one of that names comes with a whole knowledge base behind it. All this ethnobotany goodness. Isn't that something that should fascinate us and intrigue us? And so that's my little, and in a way, I've talked about this before, and I have the list from Len. Thank you, Len, for the Maori names, and I've started working on putting them in. But I would hope that people would send me names. I'm looking for names. Connect me with people, and I'm happy to take whatever, even if it's one name, I don't care. And for the iTree species database, it can be trees, shrubs, palms, and bamboo.
The other way people could contribute, I guess, is the publication in communication biology has the capacity there for you to go online and add comments. So if you support the idea, you could just add online, you know, your support for that publication. So that's one way of just sort of registering that support, I guess. But I think it's just about expanding the debate, you know, in any fora that you have available.
Well, I think there's, looking at the chat and just obviously listening to the two of you, I think there's a lot of support for this, and I think it makes sense to an awful lot of people. So we'll chat at a later date, Len, and then we'll mobilize the forces out there in webinar land to support this, I'm sure. I've just dropped my phone. One question, and maybe this is for both of you really, Len generally with the project, but also Naomi perhaps for iTree. A question from Anthony. Anthony, as ever, is asking a tricky question. Who decides what constitutes an Indigenous name or language? Does it have to be currently spoken when many languages are endangered themselves? Anthony's saying he's thinking locally of the places like Breton, Cornish, Gaelic, Manx, Welsh, limited use amongst even the local existing population. And that's before we even start getting into the local dialect vernacular names as well. So who is it who's saying what counts as an actual Indigenous language? Len, I'll ask you first, and Naomi, you have some thoughts from your work.
So the idea that we're putting forward is that the Indigenous people need to provide some evidence to show that is the only Indigenous name for that species. So where you might have different cultures that are overlapping each other and they all have different names for the same species, then those species are not candidates for having their name changed. So it's only in those limited situations where there is a clear Indigenous name that applies to that species right across its range. So if it's if it's known by different names in different parts of that species range, then there would need to either be a consensus among those Indigenous people on a name. They may be just dialectic differences, so there might be possible for a consensus around some sort of spelling that compromises, or there has to be a clear single name that is from a single Indigenous group. So it's not going to be something that is universal. We can't rename everything, that's for certain. But even if it's only a few Indigenous names that get promoted and changed in the system, I think that's hugely powerful for people. And so in some cases there may be Indigenous people that won't be able to make use of this, but it's still a step forward, I think. And for a lot of people in a lot of parts of the world, they will be able to make use of this process.
Brilliant. Thank you, Len. Thanks, Naomi. Oh, actually, Naomi, I was going to say, if you had any thoughts on that particular question, sorry, from Anthony, I cut you off. Anthony asked about what constitutes an Indigenous, whether it's a name or indeed an Indigenous language, if there's any particular parameters around that when you're considering your work with iTree.
Well, there's this whole issue in the United States of tribes, or I don't like to use this word, nations losing their status as proper nations within the Indigenous community. I mean, the U.S. government is so. If a peoples recognize themselves as First Peoples, then and they have a language and they have a culture, and then for me, that's enough for me. Because I'm not so much focused on the trying to influence the taxonomic authority. I'm more interested in recognizing an Indigenous name for the species that's within the iTree database and making this connection to its the history that predates the person that appeared on the scene and was shown this species and then carried it off and got some name attached to it. So I guess I have a different relationship to this whole thing. And it's not as quite official as it might be, but kind of goes with everything else I do.
With your iTree though, Naomi, it's a different situation in that you can potentially have half a dozen or more names represented from different Indigenous groups for a particular species. So there's much more flexibility there. Whereas the proposal that I'm making for a formal name change to the scientific name, there can only be one name. And so it only applies in those circumstances where there is clearly one Indigenous name that has priority chronologically.
Mm-hmm.
So it is the first name, First Nation people, etc.
Right. So as I said, your approach is more official than this little thing that I'm doing, but actually one of the arguments that you presented opposing this idea is that there might be many Indigenous names for the same species. I believe that where the species was discovered is documented. And one way to push back against this idea of, well, there's too many Indigenous names for the one might be, what's the Indigenous name for where it was originally discovered?
You mean discovered by science as opposed to discovered by Indigenous people?
Correct. So where it was originally discovered by whoever facilitated the naming of it, there was probably, and they were probably guided to it by somebody indigenous. And what's the indigenous name from that community?
Possibly, but I think that might do a disservice to another indigenous group. And certainly at this stage anyway, my preference is that we just leave those names alone, that those ones, we don't try and change the names to those.
Okay.
It's only where there is a clear single indigenous name.
Okay, sure.
It maybe far down in the future, there might be some sort of process that could be possible there, but you'd need to be very careful that you, in trying to sort of elevate the rights of one indigenous group of people, you didn't then tread on somebody else's rights.
Agreed.
Len, I want to ask you a question that might sound difficult. It's not intended to be difficult, but when we talk about when a name is put forward as being an indigenous name, that the indigenous group has to demonstrate that that name is in existence, sort of thing, before it's adopted. Who are they demonstrating that to?
They would put that in a publication submission to something like Taxon, the journal, and so a normal peer review process would then be undertaken. You'd have a specialist editor for indigenous names, and that editor would then send it out to review to people that are experienced in sort of unpicking that kind of evidence. So people that are have social science background, geographers, social geographers, etc. And so we go through a peer review process.
I guess the slightly mischievous thinking behind that question was, is it sort of problematic if you have indigenous peoples having to demonstrate to a predominantly Western sort of academic construct that their name should be reflected? Is that in itself is sort of problematic, isn't it?
Yeah, that's true. And I'm not suggesting that this is perfect, this idea, but certainly it's still a step forward from what we have at the moment. And I would say that among the reviewers, there would be, you would want to have indigenous people. Obviously, you can't have everybody, all indigenous peoples represented on a particular board or among reviewers, but you would expect there to be indigenous people involved in that, yes.
Yeah, sure. And I think it's a great step forward. I was just thinking, it's just tricky.
Yeah, there are no perfect solutions in the world.
No, absolutely. No, great step forward. Right, okay, where are we? Oh, we got about 5 or 10 minutes left. Got a couple more questions. Naomi, this is a sort of philosophical, existential question that you like. A question from Jackie. Jackie's asking, do you think we'll ever have full life consideration of trees, or are we kidding ourselves? Jackie's saying, I live for my convictions of protecting and enhancing trees. However, I seem to be seeing more and more lack of understanding of their needs, even in today's modern schemes. Are we ever going to get there, Naomi? Are we ever actually going to get people to understand the importance of trees?
Yeah, it's really, it's taking the tree out of the context of the whole thing. So really, it really begins with childhood and what you teach young people and the experiential education they receive in terms of the natural world. And I think there isn't enough of teaching of what it means to be a steward, what it means to coexist with everything around you. And it's a missed opportunity to not instigate this more in children. Children are so curious, and there's ways of stimulating that curiosity through the natural world without excluding their cell phone. I mean, there's all kinds of apps and things that you can engage with them with an app, with the natural world, with getting them involved with little projects and things that actually, where they're actually the caregiver. And in developing lots of programs for children and middle school kids. I think that it doesn't matter the profession that someone ends up with. When all of us go home at night, we're all citizens. And so it's the life experiences you have from the beginning. And if you give children these tools, this engagement, stimulate this curiosity, this connection to this other mother, Mother Earth, you end up with a much better human. And you will never arrive at where we need to arrive if you don't give this to children.
Absolutely, yeah, I completely agree. We need to get people thinking about it.
All children should be encouraged to climb trees. I think there's a huge benefit from kids climbing into trees and sort of sitting in them and being surrounded by the leaf, the foliage and so on. I think that's important for kids' development.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, normally when someone says something like that, I quote Alex Shigo and I say we should go out and touch trees.
Absolutely.
But I feel at this point I should say, Naomi, who was it who encouraged you to get into Arbor Culture?
It was Alex. It was Alex and his next door neighbor, Sharon Ossenbruggen, who was my USDA urban forester. And it was because one day Sharon came to me and we were talking about some crazy project. And she said to me, Alex and I have been talking about you. And we've decided you would make a great arborist. Now, I was an urban forester. I didn't have becoming an arborist in mind. And it was because of the two of them that I became an arborist. So for me, Alex, the giant teddy bear, was one of my very small number of mentors. He was quite wonderful and quite special.
That's not a bad reference to have. Everyone go and touch trees. Like, I've got it behind me. Go and touch your trees. Brilliant. Thank you, Naomi. Okay, we've got a couple more questions, then we're going to finish up. Right. I'll ask Naomi a kind of combined question, and then we'll do one for Len. Naomi, I've got two questions about soil that you've been asked about. So I'm just going to ask them one after the other because they might be sort of combined. Jack is asking whether or not you would add beneficial microorganisms to the soil of urban trees. And Jack's particularly thinking about, should we be concerned about imported soil species, or does the benefit outweigh the concern? And then the second soil-related question is from Danny, who's asking what your view is on the ecological sustainability and viability of structural soil, for example, Stockholm soils. So tell us a bit about your thoughts on soils, firstly on microorganisms and adding those, and then on the sustainability of structural soils.
Okay, so let's think about that the tree you're going to plant is a field-grown tree. So it's growing out in a nursery. It probably is coming with some microorganisms within the root ball, as well as if there's any fine roots left, which, who knows how it's been dug, there would be hyphae already. So the elephant in the room here is, what are you planting it into? If it's classic urban soil, it doesn't matter what's in that root ball, it's not going to survive. So adding microorganisms still isn't going to get you where you need to be. The soil needs the fundamentals in order to support life, whether it's tree roots or microbial or invertebrates. It needs that structure. It needs the macropores and the micropores. It needs an organic layer. There needs to be gas exchange. There needs to be pores that retain water, but also pores that can retain air. And so this is all part of this larger organism that is soil, and it's not dependent on one piece, microorganism. It's dependent on the whole functioning as a whole. And so, well, I'm sorry, the second?
Yeah, I keep doing this, and I should stop asking people 2 questions at once because it's completely unfair, but I just carry on doing it. I don't know why I do it. The second, I see the same word appearing twice and think, well, that'll be the same question, and it's really not. So apologies to everybody. The second question was from Danny, and it was about what's your view on the ecological sustainability and viability of structural soil? For example, Stockholm soils. Danny said Stockholm soils where it can mean 80 to 85% granite or macadam, and the remaining part of the soil volume consisting of biochar.
Oh, well,
there's at least one question in that sentence as well, isn't there?
I am not a biochar fan. Biochar evolved out of agriculture. Now, if you think of agricultural crops and what they require from soil, most of those soils have a pH in upwards of 7. Most of our trees that we plant are usually in the acid to neutral range. And so now you're going to stick biochar in this soil, in this matrix construct, as if that's soil. It's not soil. So I come back to Amsterdam and CU and what they're doing here in Switzerland, which the stone matrix, and you have to be careful of that as well, because depending on what the stone is, that also plays with the pH, because you constantly have the parent material, the stone, affecting the pH. So, for example, in CU soil, you can't plant pin oak, you can't plant Quercus palustris, because it's a sweet stone. It's calcy, it's limey. So you can't plant anything that demands too much acidity of pH. So all of this, you have to explore, you have to ask questions, you have to investigate. Depending on the site, how much soil you've got in open and how much soil volume you can grab in all these other ways. But if you use this kind of matrix approach, the way it's supposed to be used, under paving, not in an extended bed where you try and create open soil, that should be soil. The ideal for structural soils is under paving as a conduit to another open landscape. That's the ideal. But regardless, if you can maintain those voids and you include soil as this filler, then you can benefit from the life cycle processes of roots, because they contribute organic to soil. Now, you won't get the organic layer, but if you can provide the air and water, then at least you have a potentially viable environment where you can stimulate root growth. And if you can stimulate root growth, you will end up with roots contributing to organic in the soil.
Yeah, I think you're right, Naomi. It's all about connecting up spaces together rather than just creating a slightly bigger island.
Correct. It's all site driven. That's why somebody asked me, well, what do I tell an architect? And what you can tell an architect is you come with the package, because it requires those of us who have a sense of how you can manipulate the space to better accommodate the tree. That's how you gain soil volume in an urban environment.
Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you, Naomi. Right. Let's do one more question for Len, and then let's do our little final question that we like to do. Len, Sarah has asked a really good question. Hi, Sarah, by the way. Sorry I missed you yesterday. I was planning to say hello and I didn't get to see you. Sarah is asking, are there other drivers with other Indigenous peoples to reclaim names that you know of? And could they all be united in their reclaiming of nomenclature? So somebody mentioned in the chat about the attempts to rename Snowdonia to the original Welsh name here. We've seen it happen with different mountains, rivers, other features. Is there a way of linking up your project more widely to other attempts to reclaim some of those names back for other things beyond plant naming?
I'm not sure if there's a formal way, but it's all part of the same narrative, I guess. And so ideas can be quite infectious, and so the more we talk about it, the more these ideas cross over each other, then the more likely we are to have progress, I think. So it is really about opening up the conversation, opening up the debate, and sharing these ideas across different areas. And yes, renaming places is part of the story. That's definitely part of the story.
Brilliant. Thank you.
I'm not sure how we link them formally, though. I can't see how that would link formally, but it is part of the same discussion.
I think it's, as you said, though, it's proliferating those ideas, isn't it? It's getting those ideas across to people who go, oh yeah, I never wondered why this particular plant in New Zealand was named in Latin after someone from Sweden.
It's called natural selection of ideas.
Yeah.
Evolution.
So there you go, folks. It's all down to you to spread it. You've got to spread it all and tell everybody about it. Okay, right. Let's do our last question. It's my favorite. It's all of your favorite. I've already shown my tree book, but let's go first of all to Naomi and ask the question, what is your favorite tree-related book, Naomi?
John. Oh. So just Alex. Think of all the books that Alex wrote. And then you've got all these myriad other books that one has. I mean, my bookshelf is like... So I decided to stay away from the technical stuff and get into more the touchy-feely stuff and the visual. And so what I picked was Bark by Cedric Poulet. And I will tell you, if you want to see pictures of bark, this is an extraordinary exploration of this extremely if Alex had touched trees, boy, oh, you see some of these pictures and you just want to get your hands inside and touch that bark. So that's my choice.
A good choice. One we haven't had before, and who doesn't want to touch bark and look at pictures of bark? I'm also laughing because Sophie and I did exactly the same thing, exactly the right time, and both wrote Cedric Poulet bark. So good stuff. Len, what's your choice?
My first choice is the Lorax by Dr Zeus. I love that story, and but can I have two?
Of course you can. I'm amazed Naomi stuck to one, so you're definitely one.
This is Native Trees of New Zealand by Dawson and Lucas, and it is the most beautifully produced book on all of New Zealand native trees. And so it's got amazing images, beautifully set out. So it's a must-have if you live in New Zealand, but I think it's a beautiful book for anybody to have. But top of the list is the Lorax. You can't beat it.
And everybody out there, if you haven't read the Lorax, go and read the Lorax right now. It is in fact brilliant. That's great. And three new choices of books to add to our ever-extending list. So that's brilliant. Thank you both. Well, look, hasn't time just flown by? We've been going for almost 2 hours. Naomi, Len, thank you both so much for just genuinely such thought-provoking talks and just really exciting stuff. And also thank you, Naomi, for introducing me to Len, because apart from being a great talk in your own right, you're also responsible for Len being here too. So thank you both. Thank you to everyone out there watching. You're all wonderful as ever. It's great to see you. Hopefully we'll see you next week. And then in all those other subsequent weeks, which will get you nice and warmed up for conference, which you should go and buy tickets for right now. But thanks, Naomi. Thanks, Len. Thanks, Sophie. Thanks, everybody. Stay safe. Look after yourselves. Go and tell everybody about renaming trees and plants, because it's important we all do. And if you have any additional questions, john@trees.org.uk, drop me an email. It'll be great to hear from you. And we'll see you all soon. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Naomi.